Othryads. Around 546 BC, somewhere on the sun-baked plain of Thyreatis, on the disputed border between Sparta and Argos, 600 of the finest soldiers in Greece spent an entire day killing each other, and when the dust finally settled, only 3 men were still breathing. The agreement that put them there was unusual even by Greek standards. Rather than commit full armies and risk catastrophic losses, Sparta and Argos decided to settle their territorial dispute over the Thyreatis region by choosing 300 champions from each side and letting them fight it out on the plain, with the understanding that whichever city's men were left standing would take the land. It was elegant in theory. In practice, it produced one of antiquity's strangest and most debated outcomes. After the fighting ended, 2 Argives named Alcinor and Chromios were the only men upright on either side, and they did what seemed rational. They walked back to Argos and reported a victory. What they failed to account for was Othryates, the single surviving Spartan who had not died yet, not quite. Gravely wounded, bleeding from injuries that would kill him within hours, Othryates did not follow the Argives off the field. According to Herodotus, writing in Book Shumthorst of his histories, and later elaborated by Plutarch in his Sayings of Spartans, Othryates crawled through the heaped bodies of his dead comrades and dragged himself upright long enough to raise a trophy of arms, the traditional Greek signal of battlefield possession. Some versions of the story, repeated across multiple ancient sources, though possibly embellished in later retellings, go further. They claim he wrote a dedication to Sparta in his own blood on his shield, before finally dying among the dead. He had refused to leave. Whether or not the blood inscription is literal history or patriotic legend, what happened next was entirely real. Both sides claimed the victory. Argos pointed to the fact that 2 of their men had walked away while only 1 Spartan survived, and that man was now dead. Sparta pointed to the trophy, the field, and the fact that their man had not retreated. The dispute could not be settled by argument, so a second full battle was fought between both cities' complete armies, and this time Sparta won decisively, taking the Thyreatis region and holding it for generations. Othryates became something more than a soldier after that. He became a moral argument, a walking, crawling, dying proof of the Spartan teaching that you do not leave the field while you have breath, that surviving your comrades is its own form of defeat, that the ground beneath your feet belongs to the man willing to die on it. His story was embedded in the Agá, Sparta's brutal educational system, as a lesson for boys being forged into soldiers, and it echoes across centuries of military culture precisely because it captures something real about what separates ordinary soldiers from those willing to pay every last coin of themselves before stopping. Leonidas I. In August of 480 BC, at a narrow coastal pass in central Greece called Thermopylae, where the cliffs come so close to the sea that a cart could barely pass through, a Spartan king named Leonidas I made a decision that would outlast his civilization by 2.5 millennia. He had arrived at the pass commanding a coalition Greek force of perhaps 7,000 men, including his personal bodyguard of 300 Spartiates, the hippies sent ahead of the main Spartan army because religious festivals temporarily prohibited a full mobilization. For 2 full days, this force held the pass against the invasion of Xerxes, the Tsar of Persia, whose army Herodotus famously claimed numbered in the millions, though modern historians estimate a more plausible figure somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 men. The geography was everything. At Thermopylae, numbers meant almost nothing because only a few men could engage at once, and Greek hoplites in a tight formation were devastating in exactly that kind of close, grinding, shoulder-to-shoulder combat. Then, on the 3rd day, a local Greek man named Ephialtes approached the Persian commanders and offered them something more valuable than any army. He told them about the Anapeia Path, a mountain track that wound behind the Greek position and came out on the other side of the pass. Xerxes sent his elite immortals down the path overnight. Leonidas learned of the flanking movement at dawn. According to Herodotus in Book 7 of his histories, Leonidas had already been told by a Delphic oracle that either Sparta would fall or a Spartan king would die, and he had come to Thermopylae understanding what that likely meant for him personally. He dismissed the majority of the allied Greek contingents, sending them south to fight another day, and remained with his 300 Spartans, roughly 700 Thespians who refused to leave even when offered the chance, and a contingent of Thebans whose loyalty was more complicated. The final stand took place outside the narrowest point of the pass, on a small hill, with the Greeks fighting until their spears broke, and then using swords and finally their hands and teeth according to the ancient accounts. Leonidas was killed in the close quarters fighting. The specific blow that killed him is not recorded, only that he fell in the thick of it, which is exactly where a Spartan king was supposed to be. What happened next tells you everything about how much Xerxes had been affected by the resistance. He ordered Leonidas' head cut off and fixed on a stake, an act so far outside Persian norms for honoring brave enemies that ancient writers treated it as evidence of personal fury. The Greeks recovered his remains years later, around 140 BC according to tradition, and repatriated them to Sparta, where Leonidas received a hero's cult and annual games called the Leonidia in his honor. The poet Semonides wrote the epitaph placed at the site, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie," one of the most reproduced lines in military history. Thermopylae became the argument that tactical defeat could be strategic victory, that the manner of dying could accomplish what survival could not, that 300 men willing to die in the right place at the right time could slow an empire and buy a civilization the days it needed to survive. Pausanias the Regent. 9 years after Thermopylae, in 479 BC, a Spartan regent named Pausanias stood at the head of the largest Greek army ever assembled and destroyed the Persian land invasion at the Battle of Plataea, killing the Persian general Mardonius and effectively ending Xerxes' campaign to conquer Greece. He was briefly the most celebrated commander in the Greek world, a man who had done what Leonidas had died trying to do. Within roughly a decade, he would be starved to death inside a walled-up sanctuary by the very state he had saved. The trajectory of his fall is one of antiquity's most studied studies in how power corrupts and how institutions defend themselves. The problems began almost immediately after Plataea. Pausanias began adopting Persian customs, wearing Persian clothing, surrounding himself with Persian-style ceremony, behavior that Spartans, who prided themselves on austerity and collective quality, found deeply alarming. Then came the allegations of treason, letters reported by Thucydides in Book 1 of his Histories, in chapters 128 through 135, purportedly showing Pausanias in secret correspondence with Xerxes III, offering to deliver Greece to Persian control in exchange for power and a royal marriage into the Achaemenid dynasty. He was recalled to Sparta once, put on trial, and acquitted, either because the evidence was insufficient or because his prestige still protected him. He went back to operating independently in the north of Greece. The allegations continued to pile up, and eventually the Ephors, Sparta's 5 annually elected executive magistrates, who held enormous power over even the kings, decided they had enough. When they moved to arrest him a second time, Pausanias received a warning, possibly from a friend who noticed the pattern of the Ephors' movements. He ran. Specifically, he ran to the sanctuary of Athena Chalkioikos, Athena of the Brazen House on the Spartan Acropolis, because Greek religious law was absolute on one point. You could not drag a suppliant from a sanctuary. The gods protected those within. The Ephors faced a genuine dilemma. They could not violate the sanctuary without committing sacrilege, but they could not let him simply live there indefinitely either. Their solution was methodical and brutal. They ordered the sanctuary walled up around him. They stripped the roof to expose him to the elements. They posted guards to make sure no food or water reached him inside. Plutarch, whose account includes a detail that may be legendary but is hard to forget, writes that Pausanias' own mother brought the first stone to the wall, symbolically disowning her son and affirming the community's judgment over maternal feeling. Inside the airless, roofless, foodless sanctuary, the man who had saved Greece starved. When he was close enough to death that the Ephors judged he would not survive, they had him carried outside the threshold so that he would technically die on unsacred ground and not pollute the sanctuary. He died shortly after being moved. His death was a message as much as an execution. Not even the hero of Plataea was above the collective authority of the Spartan state. An individual ambition of the kind Pausanias displayed was the one thing the system would never tolerate. Callicratidas. In 406 BC, in the waters of the Aegean Sea, near a cluster of small islands called Arginusi, off the coast of Lesbos, a Spartan admiral named Callicratidas led his fleet into battle knowing he was probably going to lose, and chose to fight anyway on the grounds that retreating was beneath him. Callicratidas had replaced Lysander as Spartan Navarch, the annually rotating fleet commander, and had almost immediately distinguished himself as something rare in the late Peloponnesian War. A Spartan leader who found the entire arrangement of Persian subsidies paying for Spartan ships genuinely shameful. While Lysander had cultivated a close personal relationship with the Persian prince Cyrus, and was comfortable with the transactional nature of the war's financing, Callicratidas reportedly told the Persian court that he would not demean himself by waiting at their doors for money, and that the Greeks should stop letting barbarians decide the outcome of Greek wars. It was a principled position that his circumstances did not support. He assembled his fleet, won significant early victories, and blockaded the Athenian Admiral Conon at Mytilene with around 170 ships. Athens, facing the loss of one of their best commanders in his fleet, assembled an emergency relief force of around 150 triremes, crewed in part by slaves who were promised freedom for their service, a measure of how desperate the situation was. When his officers assessed the enemy fleet gathering at Arginusi and advised him to withdraw, Callicratidas reportedly said it would be shameful for Sparta to run from anyone, and ordered the engagement. The battle was large, chaotic, and ultimately went to Athens. During the fighting, Callicratidas' flagship was rammed. He was thrown into the sea. Xenophon, who provides the core account in his Hellenica, records his death with notable brevity, a few words noting that he fell overboard and was not recovered, which somehow makes it more final than an elaborate description would. His body was never found. The Aegean kept him. The Athenian victory at Arginusi was real but short-lived, and the infamous aftermath in which the Athenian assembly tried and executed 8 of their own victorious generals for failing to rescue survivors from the water in a storm, destroyed Athenian naval leadership far more effectively than any Spartan action could have. Lysander was recalled, his Persian funding pipeline reopened, and within 2 years, the war was over. Callicratidas died for a principal position that history proved was strategically irrelevant. He is remembered by Xenophon and others with a kind of quiet respect, precisely because he was right about the corrupting nature of Persian dependency, even if being right cost him everything. Brasidas. In the summer of 422 BC, outside the walls of Amphipolis in Thrace, a Spartan general named Brasidas launched a surprise attack against an Athenian force commanded by the demagogue Cleon, and in the course of winning the battle was struck by a mortal wound that he survived just long enough to hear about his own victory before dying. Brasidas was unlike almost any Spartan commander of his era. A man who combined genuine tactical creativity with diplomatic skill, sophisticated enough to win cities through persuasion rather than siege, offering liberation rather than Spartan domination in a war where Sparta's reputation for replacing Athenian control with its own was already becoming a problem. His northern campaign, running from 424 to 422 BC, took him through Thrace and Macedonia, where he convinced a series of Athenian-allied cities to defect, promising them autonomy and making the promises credible through his own conduct and manner. His greatest prize came in the winter of 424 BC when he arrived outside Amphipolis, a strategically vital Athenian colony on the Strymon River, rich in timber and silver, deeply important to Athens' ability to fund the war. The Athenian general sent to relieve it arrived hours too late, his forces unable to cross the river in time, and Amphipolis negotiated its own terms with Brasidas, rather than wait to be taken by force. That Athenian general was Thucydides, the historian. His failure at Amphipolis earned him a 20-year exile, which he spent, as he himself notes, on both sides of the conflict, gathering the material that became his History of the Peloponnesian War, one of the foundational documents of Western historical writing. Brasidas, the man whose success gave Thucydides his leisure to be a historian, is described in that history with notable admiration. At Amphipolis in 422 BC, the Athenian assembly sent Cleon north to retake the city. Cleon was a powerful political figure, but a limited military commander, and Brasidas recognized immediately that the Athenian force was poorly positioned outside the walls and moving without proper reconnaissance. He launched a sally from the city gates with a small force, hit the Athenian column at an angle before it could form properly, and routed them. During the fighting, Brasidas was wounded severely enough that his men carried him back inside the city. Cleon, attempting to flee the rout, was killed by a Spartan peltast. Brasidas lived long enough, according to Thucydides, to be told that the Athenians had been driven off. Then he died. The people of Amphipolis gave him the most remarkable funeral a Greek city could give an outsider. They demolished the existing monument to Hagnon, the city's Athenian founder, and refounded the city itself with Brasidas as its heroic katist, its founding ancestor, with annual sacrifices, games in his honor, and the full cult worship normally reserved for gods and legendary heroes. The Peace of Nicias followed within months, named for the men who negotiated it rather than the 2 men whose deaths made it politically possible. August II. August II reigned as Eurypontid king of Sparta for roughly 28 years, from around 427 to 400 BC, commanded the Spartan army through the defining final phase of the Peloponnesian War, and died not on a battlefield, but on a road in Arcadia, ill and fading. attended by courtiers who were already calculating what his death would mean politically before he had finished dying. His most significant military contribution was the occupation of Deceleia, a fortified post in the hills of northern Attica that Spartan forces held continuously from 413 to 404 BC, a strategy suggested originally by Alcibiades during his Spartan exile. The occupation of Deceleia was not spectacular in the way that Thermopylae or Leuctra were spectacular, but it was devastating in the accumulated, grinding way that matters strategically. Athenian farmers could not work their fields. The silver mines at Laurion, which funded the Athenian fleet, were disrupted when more than 20,000 slaves escaped to the Spartan lines. Supply routes into Attica were constantly threatened. The Athenian economy bled steadily for 7 years, and when Lysander finally destroyed the Athenian fleet at Aegospotami in 405 BC, the city that surrendered the following year was already hollowed out. August died somewhere around 400 or 398 BC. The sources are not perfectly consistent on the date, reportedly of illness while traveling, with some accounts placing his death at Heraia in Arcadia. What made his death politically explosive was the question of succession. His son Leotychides was widely rumored in Sparta and beyond to be the biological son not of Agis but of Alcibiades, the Athenian politician and general who had spent time as a guest in exile in Sparta years earlier. Plutarch, in his Life of Alcibiades, records the allegation with the additional detail that Alcibiades reportedly boasted about it himself, saying he had not seduced a Spartan queen for mere pleasure, but to produce a son who would one day rule Sparta. Agis had reportedly refused for years to formally acknowledge Leotychides as his heir. But on his deathbed, with witnesses summoned, he relented and declared the boy legitimate. Whether this was genuine feeling, political calculation, or the result of pressure from family members who needed the succession settled, no ancient source can tell us. It did not matter anyway. The succession went not to Leotychides, but to Agesilaus, Agis' half-brother, on the advice of Lysander, and supported by an oracle that was later revealed to have been obtained through Lysander's manipulation of the Delphic priests. A dying king's last political act, the legitimization of his heir, was undone before his body reached home. Lysander was the man who won the Peloponnesian War for Sparta, the architect of the strategy that strangled Athenian sea power, the political operator who installed Spartan-friendly oligarchies across the Aegean world, and the most powerful non-royal figure in Spartan history. And he was killed in 395 BC outside a mid-tier Boeotian city called Haliartus, in circumstances that bear the fingerprints of deliberate political assassination organized by his own state. The mechanism was elegant in its indirection. By the early 390s BC, Lysander's influence had grown to a degree that alarmed both kings and rival factions within Sparta. He was recalled from various commands, sidelined, humiliated in small ways by men who understood that confronting him directly was dangerous. The solution they settled on was to give him a command that looked important but was structured to fail. He was assigned to lead one column of a two-pronged invasion of Boeotia, with the Aegead king Pausanias commanding the second column. The plan required both columns to coordinate and arrive simultaneously. Lysander marched his force to Haliartus and attempted first to incite the city to revolt from within, presumably relying on Sparta's network of sympathizers throughout the Greek world. When that failed, he was left with his force camped outside a hostile city, waiting for Pausanias' army that was not coming, because Pausanias, whether by deliberate delay or genuine logistical difficulty, was not marching at the pace the plan required. A Theban force sallied from Haliartus and attacked. In the fighting, Lysander was killed. The exact manner of his death is not described with precision in the sources, only that it happened in the engagement outside the walls. Pausanias arrived afterward, found the situation lost, and negotiated a truce to recover the Spartan dead, including Lysander's body, the formal ancient Greek acknowledgement of defeat. He was subsequently tried in Sparta for his delay and condemned to death, fleeing into exile at Tegea rather than face execution, which rather suggests that whatever his reasons for the delay, the political result was exactly what some people in Sparta had hoped for. The aftermath of Lysander's death included a discovery that his political enemies, or allies, depending on how you read it, found either conveniently or genuinely. Documents allegedly outlining a scheme to make the Spartan kingship elective and open to non-Heraclid candidates, a plan that, if implemented, would have made Lysander himself eligible for the throne. Plutarch devotes several chapters of his Life of Lysander to this constitutional document and the debate over its authenticity. Whether the documents were real or planted, they served their purpose. They ensured that Lysander died not just as a defeated commander, but as a would-be tyrant, a man whose ambitions had exceeded what even Sparta's most powerful figure was permitted to reach for. Cleomenes I. Cleomenes was one of the most consequential and genuinely strange figures in all of Spartan history. An Aegean king who reigned from around 520 to 490 BC and spent that reign aggressively reshaping the political landscape of Greece, intervening in Athens to expel the Peisistratid tyrants, marching against Argos, manipulating the Delphic oracle, and generally operating with a boldness that made him uniquely effective and uniquely dangerous. And he died in a Spartan prison in a manner so disturbing that ancient writers preserved every detail while disagreeing entirely about what it meant. The immediate circumstances of his death, as recorded by Herodotus in Book 6 of his histories, are these. Cleomenes began behaving with extreme erratic violence, striking Spartan citizens in the face with his staff when he encountered them, behavior alarming enough that his family, according to Herodotus, arranged to have him restrained and held in the stocks. While imprisoned, he spoke so forcefully and commandingly to the Helot guard assigned to watch him that the guard, overawed by the sheer authority the king projected even in chains, handed him a knife when he demanded one. Cleomenes then, methodically and without apparent haste, began cutting himself. He started with his legs, slicing strips of flesh from his shins, then moved upward to his thighs, then his sides, working his way up his body until he died from the accumulated wounds. Herodotus records the whole sequence with the flat precision of someone reporting a thing too strange to embellish. What caused the madness is where the story fractures into multiple competing explanations, each reflecting the prejudices of its teller. The Spartans themselves attributed it to the habit Cleomenes had developed of drinking unmixed wine, learned from Scythian ambassadors, because Greeks mixed their wine with water and considered drinking it straight a barbarian practice. The Argives said it was divine punishment for the massacre he had ordered after the Battle of Sapea, around 494 BC, where he trapped Argive survivors in a sacred grove and burned them alive. The Athenians attributed it to his corruption of the Delphic oracle through bribery, a charge that several ancient sources take seriously. Modern historians add a further possibility that the madness was not genuine mental illness, but a cover story constructed after the fact to conceal a political murder carried out by the Ephors, who had both motive and means. His half-brother Leonidas the Fen succeeded him and marched to Thermopylae a decade later. Cleombrotus I. On a flat plain near a small Boeotian town called Leuctra, in July of 371 BC, an Aegean king of Sparta named Cleombrotus I led his army into a battle that lasted less than an hour and destroyed 3 centuries of Spartan military supremacy so completely that it never recovered. Sparta had ruled the Greek world since the end of the Peloponnesian War in 404 BC. Its armies considered effectively unbeatable in open field combat. Its infantry the gold standard against which all other Greek soldiers were measured. At Leuctra, the Theban general Epaminondas dismantled all of that with a geometric innovation. Instead of distributing his best troops evenly across the battle line, he stacked them 50 shields deep on his left flank, directly opposite the Spartan right, where Cleombrotus and the Spartan elite were positioned. This oblique formation, later called the refused flank tactic, meant that the weakest part of the Theban line would engage the weakest part of the Spartan line as slowly as possible, while the massive concentrated weight of the Theban left crushed through the Spartan right before the rest of the battle could develop. Before the infantry even made contact, the Spartan cavalry, which had been placed in front of their own lines in an unusual deployment, was routed by superior Theban horsemen and fell back in disorder directly into the advancing Spartan infantry, breaking their formation at the worst possible moment. Then the Theban column hit them, 50 men deep, driving into Spartiates who were already disordered and crowded. Cleombrotus was killed in the fighting on the right wing. He was not the only one. Approximately 400 of the 700 Spartiates present at Leuctra died in that single engagement. To understand why this number is catastrophic, consider that by 371 BC, the total Spartiate class, the full citizen soldiers of Sparta, numbered only around 1,000 to 1,500 men, the result of decades of casualties, low birth rates, and the rigid citizenship requirements that excluded even many Spartan-born men from the class. Losing 400 of them in an afternoon was not a defeat, it was an amputation. Sparta sent the traditional herald to request their dead for burial, the ritual acknowledgement that formally confirmed defeat and carried their dead home. Xenophon, who was a Spartan sympathizer and whose Hellenica is the main continuous narrative of this period, writes about Leuctra with a compressed, almost pained brevity that speaks volumes about what the battle meant to those who had believed in Spartan invincibility. Within years, Epaminondas marched into the Peloponnese itself, liberated the Messenian Helots, whose labor had been the economic foundation of the Spartan state for generations, and founded the city of Messene on Spartan-claimed territory. Cleombrotus died in the battle. The Sparta he commanded died with him, even if the city itself would persist for centuries as a diminished, nostalgic shadow of what it had been. Agesilaus II. Agesilaus II spent roughly 40 years as Eurypontid king of Sparta, from around 399 to 359 BC, presiding over the full arc of Spartan hegemony from its confident peak through the catastrophe of Leuctra and into the humbling aftermath. And he died not in battle, but at sea, somewhere along the Libyan coast, at approximately 84 years of age, on his way home from serving as a mercenary commander in Egypt, a detail that tells you almost everything about what had happened to Sparta in the final years of his reign. Agesilaus himself was a striking figure in person and in reputation, described by Plutarch as small, lame from birth in one leg, physically unimpressive to strangers, but carrying such concentrated authority that men who met him expecting someone more imposing invariably found themselves unsettled by how completely he commanded a room without trying. He is the subject of Xenophon's full biographical encomium, one of the few complete ancient biographies to survive, and appears throughout Plutarch's parallel lives as a man of genuine Spartan virtue and genuine Spartan limitation, devoted to his city's supremacy in ways that sometimes tipped into a rigidity that cost Sparta strategically. By the 360s BC, after Leuctra, after the liberation of Messenia, after the Theban invasions of the Peloponnese that Sparta could not repel, the city's finances were ruined. The Helot labor that had freed the Spartiates from economic work was gone. The citizen population was declining. The city needed money. Agesilaus in his 80s solved this problem the way a man without many options left solves problems. He took the work available to him. He traveled to Egypt and hired himself out as a military commander to the Egyptian court, lending Spartan military prestige and his own expertise in exchange for gold. Ancient sources disagree on whether his patron was Tachos or Nectanebo II, a point worth clarifying for accuracy, but the basic shape of the arrangement is consistent. He conducted himself with the austere simplicity that Spartans prized even in foreign courts, reportedly refusing elaborate gifts and ceremonial accommodations that Egyptian officials considered standard courtesies. On the voyage home, somewhere along the North African coastline at a place the ancient sources call the Harbor of Menelaus, likely corresponding to the area of modern Marsa Matruh in Egypt, Agesilaus died. His companions, unwilling to bury a Spartan king in foreign soil and far from home, preserved his body in wax, according to Plutarch, and carried it back to Sparta for a state funeral. The image of an elderly, lame, once great king mummified in wax on a ship sailing home across the Mediterranean is one of the most arresting in all of ancient biography. A man who had commanded armies from the Aegean to Asia Minor, who had fought Persians and Thebans and Corinthians and Athenians, preserved like a specimen and carried back to a city that was already becoming a monument to its own past. Isadas. In 362 BC, the Theban general Epaminondas did something that Spartans of the previous generation would have treated as a statement of suicidal arrogance. He marched his army directly toward the city of Sparta itself, the first enemy force to threaten the city in centuries, banking on speed and surprise to take it before defenders could organize. Sparta had no walls, had famously never needed them, relying on the walls of its men rather than stone. But in 362 BC, the men available were fewer than they had ever been, and the city was genuinely, terrifyingly vulnerable. What emerged from that crisis was one of the most extraordinary individual performances in ancient military history, and it belonged to a young Spartan named Isadas, who, according to Plutarch in his Life of Agesilaus, was in the middle of his pre-battle preparations when the alarm sounded and simply ran out to fight without finishing, without armor, without clothing. Anointed with the olive oil used before training or battle, armed with nothing but a spear and a sword, physically striking in the way ancient sources describe without embarrassment, Plutarch notes his beauty and physical form as though it were a military fact. Isadas ran into the streets where Theban soldiers were pushing into the city. What happened next is difficult to explain in purely rational terms. He fought through the enemy, was not wounded despite receiving no protection at all, and drove men back by what witnesses described in terms that implied divine intervention, as though some god was deflecting the blows that should have killed him. He survived. The Thebans were ultimately repulsed, Sparta was not taken, and Isadas returned from the street fighting intact. The Ephors then did two things simultaneously that could only happen in Sparta. They fined him for violating the rule that Spartan soldiers must fight in proper armor, because military discipline was collective and non-negotiable, and they awarded him a crown for the bravery of his individual action, because what he had done was objectively magnificent. Both acts happened together, The fine and the crown, delivered in the same moment, were not contradictory in the Spartan view. They were the complete Spartan view. The system honoring extraordinary courage while insisting that even extraordinary courage must operate within the collective framework that makes courage possible in the first place. Eusebius did not die in this engagement, which makes him the outlier on this list, but his story was preserved precisely because it captures something essential about the Spartan tension between the individual and the collective, and because the 362 BC raid on Sparta itself was one of the most psychologically significant events in the city's long decline. Grillos. At the Battle of Mantinea in 362 BC, a young man named Grillos died in the cavalry fighting and was mourned across the Greek world with an intensity that seems, at first, disproportionate for a soldier who was not a king or a general, until you understand who his father was and what the battle itself meant for Greek history. Grillos was the son of Xenophon, the Athenian-born writer, soldier, and devoted admirer of Sparta, who had been exiled from Athens in part for his pro-Spartan sympathies, and had been given an estate at Scylla in the Peloponnese by the Spartans in gratitude for his service with the 10,000, the Greek mercenary force whose retreat from Persia he had helped lead, and then immortalized in his Anabasis. Raised in that Peloponnesian context, educated in an environment shaped by Spartan values and Xenophon's own idealization of Spartan discipline, Grillos fought in the Spartan cause. Mantinea in 362 BC was the last great battle of the classical period's inner-city struggles, pitting Epaminondas and his Theban-led alliance against a coalition that included Sparta and Athens fighting on the same side, a diplomatic realignment that showed how completely the old wartime categories had dissolved. Epaminondas deployed his forces with the same oblique, weighted flank approach he had used at Leuctra, and was winning the battle decisively when he was struck by a spear during the push and mortally wounded. He was carried from the field. When he was told that Thebes had won, he reportedly said that he had lived long enough, then died. Grillos was killed in the cavalry engagement that preceded the main infantry clash. Multiple ancient sources, including Diodorus Siculus and Pausanias in his description of Greece, record that Grillos struck or wounded Epaminondas in this cavalry skirmish, an attribution that, if accurate, means an Athenian-raised son of a Spartan sympathizer delivered the wound that killed the man who had destroyed Spartan military supremacy. Ancient writers clearly found this narrative satisfying, which is reason enough to approach it with some caution, and historians note it as a tradition rather than a certainty. What is less disputed is the scope of the mourning. Aristotle reportedly wrote a work praising Grillos, now lost, that was significant enough to be mentioned by later ancient writers. Multiple Greek cities allegedly commissioned paintings of him. Xenophon himself, according to Diogenes Laertius writing in his Lives of Eminent Philosophers, heard of his son's death while performing a religious sacrifice. He removed his garland when the news arrived, in the Greek gesture of mourning, but then replaced it and completed the sacrifice, because a man formed by Spartan values did not let personal grief interrupt religious duty. Whether that story is biography or hagiography, it contains a truth about what Sparta had meant as a cultural model for men like Xenophon, a system that demanded you finish what you started, that the ritual mattered more than your feelings about it, that you completed the sacrifice and wept later if you wept at all. Mantinea settled nothing and resolved nothing. Both Epaminondas and Grillos died. The battle was tactically a Theban success and strategically a void, and within 20 years, Philip II of Macedon would make every question about Spartan or Theban or Athenian supremacy irrelevant by answering it himself. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.